I am completely sorry. You did not hear any of that. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Kunis, and I'm the projects coordinator at the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. The RGP works to preserve and enhance the Delaware River's natural, cultural, and recreational resources. Education is an important part of our mission. Today's preservation is sponsored by the PA Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Welcome to what's becoming Snakehead Summer. The snakehead has recently been in the news with local sightings. Today, we will explore the invasive snakehead and other native and non-native species in the Delaware River. Allow me to introduce you to Travis Pantaleo. Travis explored and learned about fisheries in the Pacific Northwest, New England, and even Italy. This has allowed him to volunteer with county conservation districts, nonprofits, and several chapters of Trout Unlimited. He's currently the vice president of Cook Creek's Watershed Association and media officer for the Watershed Coalition of Lehigh Valley. Please add your questions to Q&A section, and I will read them at the end for Travis to answer. Take it away, Travis.
All right, thank you, Cindy. Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining me. As Cindy mentioned, my name is Travis Pantaleo, and I am a volunteer with the Cooks Creek Watershed Association. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about the Delaware, its many tributaries, and obviously the Delaware Estuary. You can kind of see from my introduction slide, little play on words with fish tails. There will be plenty of tales with as far as my fishing adventures are concerned, and you can see the copious amount of actual fish tails on that slide. So with that, we'll kind of get started with the next slide, please. All right, so for me, in presentations, I don't like to use a lot of words on the screen, so we'll see a lot of pictures, and beyond that, just fish, facts, and stories. Up there on the top left, you'll see the brook trout and the alewife. So we'll start with the upper reaches of the Delaware system, and here we're looking at both branches, the east and west, as they confluence to form the Delaware River that we kind of know as it flows down, at least where I am here in Upper Bucks County, and the rest of the reaches before it hits the estuary down south of Trenton and Philadelphia. So this will include some interesting information on the alewife and what they mean to the trout fishery. Next, we'll move into somewhat of a transition zone where we can still find trout in some of the colder water tributaries of the Delaware, but we're really going to concentrate on the warm water species that, quote unquote, represent the Delaware River fishing once you get down below the Delaware Water Gap and probably upstream of Trenton. From there, we're going to look at the striped bass and the shad. So again, this is going to be more of an estuary focus. We'll talk about some of the other game fish that are down there, but these are two really iconic species for a variety of reasons. And even though they are found up and down the Delaware system as a whole, the estuary obviously plays a vital importance because of their anadromous characteristics, meaning that they will migrate both in and out of freshwater and saltwater. So at this point, we're going to keep a relative focus on migratory species, and we're going to look at the sturgeon as well as the American eel. Both have very unique backgrounds, interesting facts about their life cycles, and again, what they represent to the greater definition of the Delaware. From that point, we're going to go into the snakehead discussion, and I want to pose a question here for everybody to keep in mind. And you'll see it on the next slide. A lot of these species that we're about to talk about are ones that we know that are common in the Delaware. And the way that they're referred to go from native to wild to invasive or non-native. And so I'll give a specific example with the brown trout, obviously a very popular game fish. It was introduced as a game fish in the 1800s. We refer to them as wild brown trout now in the angling sense, not native brown trout. And what is interesting about the snakehead is that we labeled as invasive, but I want everybody to kind of think about, is there a point in time where we will refer to them as wild as we have so many other species, or if we kind of move past that point in the angling and conservation and any other world that looks at these types of issues to actually be able to use that type of proper terminology and look to make a different type of movement against what we consider invasive based on a variety of reasons. So somewhat of a short introduction there for that specific species. And then from there, I'm going to go into a brief look at the minnows of Cooks Creek watershed, the watershed that I'm a member of. And this is really just so that we all understand the tributaries to the Delaware and what they mean from a supply style system and some of the higher water quality minnows that we expect to see in these tributaries. And that way we can kind of gauge what the tributaries mean as they flow into the Delaware proper. So a lot to cover. I'll keep an eye on the clock so we can get to some good Q&A towards the end. And with that, I'll ask for the next slide. All right, so kind of like I admitted to, there are a variety of species in the Delaware system. And kind of what I just talked about, we have a lot of what we consider native and a lot of what we consider non-native, invasive, or even introduced. So outside of the box, we have all of our native species. And so again, you see the brook trout, you see the alewife there on the top right hand of the screen, the American eel, pumpkin seed, the lamprey, both our Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon, striped bass, shad, and then we see a couple of our minnows with the bowfin, which isn't necessarily a minnow, but some of the ones that we don't necessarily think about because they're so seldom encountered. We kind of think about the ones in the box a little bit more because these are our game species. So you have the brown trout, you have muskie, walleye, both the flathead and channel cats, your largemouth bass and your smallmouth bass, and even your bluegill. Now, I'm not saying that these fish aren't native to Pennsylvania. These ones just weren't necessarily native to the Delaware watershed. You have the channel catfish and the flathead catfish. These weren't even native to the Atlantic coast north of Florida. They're more of a Midwestern species that have obviously migrated east and have become more of a game species as they've been introduced through stocking programs. Same thing with the bass, both smallmouth and largemouth, the muskellunge or muskie, and even the bluegill. Bluegill weren't even originally believed to be part of the Atlantic watershed. And then you had those species that I referred to previously as being out towards Lake Erie and the Ohio River watersheds. They've obviously been moved further east, like I mentioned. But it really kind of puts in perspective that a lot of these species that we pursue within the Delaware, maybe half are considered native, with, kind of brook trout being the iconic with the upper Delaware, striped bass, pumpkin seed, the American eel, the shad, obviously, and then the sturgeon. Not all of them are game fish, but these are the ones that I want to primarily focus on. And so with the next slide, we'll kind of get into the how they're distributed throughout the system. So this is really just a quick reference point so that we kind of understand just how diverse the Delaware is. We have our cold water fishes and ranging all the way to our warm water, and we'll kind of understand as the process or the presentation goes on why we'll find some of these species where we do versus others. So on the far left, you have your cold water species, and this includes our native brook trout and the slimy sculpin, which I got a picture of later on the presentation, which is great because for the longest time, I usually only concentrate on pursuing game fish, but I've really taken on a deeper appreciation for the minnow and some of the support species that make up the watershed, not only here with Cooks Creek, but those found out through the Delaware system. Other trout species would fit into this category as well, such as bull trout out west, where it's generally advised not to fish for trout when the water temperature is above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of you may know the reference to no fish dry July, and that's both a mix of air temperature as well as water temperature, where fish just can't necessarily handle higher water temps mixed with fight time, hooking procedures, and air temperature. And this is really about trout. So I make the reference to 65 degrees for like brook trout, rainbows. Browns are a little bit higher, but then the bull trout out west is actually 55 degrees. So I've yet to come across water here that's that cold during summer. I know there's going to be some up north around the east and west branch of the Delaware, but down here, we don't see anything like that. Obviously, no bull trout, but just a good comparison between some of our East Coast and West Coast trout cousins. And so then we move from the brown trout into some of our cool water fishes. So kind of think higher 60s, low 70s, and then you have your transition fishes into the warm water fishes. And these are all the ones that you'll kind of find down here in the lower Delaware as you move towards the estuary. And largemouth bass, bluegill, carp. If you ever walk the canal path, both on either the New Jersey side or Pennsylvania side, you've probably seen carp hanging out in the dog days of summer, just kind of milling about, and their tolerance for water is pretty high, and they are surface feeders, so they have a very high tolerance for heat. Bullhead catfish, kind of your bottom dwellers, that can hang out maybe a little bit lower below the thermocline. And then bass, bluegill, you've been to any pond, any farm pond where the water is bathtub warm, and you'll see them swimming around. So we have all this here. And it's amazing because even up in the higher tributaries, you get the nice cold water where you can fish for brook trout and then be in the main stem of the Delaware fishing for some of these warmer water species. So there's really a lot of variety, which makes it such a great area to be able to travel up and down. And so let's get into our first region. Next slide, please. And we'll focus here on the upper Delaware. So there's no shortage of literature or website referrals when it comes to trout in these waters. This area focuses primarily on dry fly fishing for larger brown trout and rainbows. And it's like, we're already kind of getting into seeing a fishery that focuses on non-native or at least wild species. And they do naturally reproduce, which is helpful in the fact that you have some wild run species that just have a completely different set of genetics and are associated with a better fight, living a little bit more as a native fish would. But then they also compete against the native brook trout. Not to say that the three can't coexist, but there's been studies where brook trout, or I'm sorry, rainbow trout will outcompete browns and brookies because they have a different effect on macroinvertebrates. Same thing to say with brown trout and how they can prey upon native brook trout, fry, and eggs, and just outcompete based on size alone. But with that, we have the East Branch and the West Branch, and they both have unique characteristics worth discussing. So with the East Branch in the top image, you can make out the Pepacton Reservoir, and I apologize in advance if I've said that name incorrectly. And then the West Branch there on the middle image, towards the bottom left, there's the Cannonsville Reservoir. And both of these create what are called tailwater fisheries. They exist only because of the cold water available from the outflow of the reservoir. And both of these reservoirs allow for the brown trout to be in excess of about 10 pounds. So you're going to find a lot of your larger trout in these areas. And a lot of that is owed to the alewife population that are found in these reservoirs, even to the fact where they actually will end up on the other side of the reservoir and in the West Branch or the East Branch. And an alewife is a native fish, a native migratory bait fish that can actually live its entire life cycle in fresh water. So it's become this unique little piece of the ecosystem in both reservoirs and on the branches as well that provide for some greater trophy trout fishing because of their presence. And then so again, for the different branches, you'll see here with the diagrams, we have a couple of gauging stations. And as I mentioned before, you have a few temperatures there coming in well below the 65-degree threshold, even some of the waters down there into the 40s. And this is what I took these screenshots in July from USGS. And so you can see that even in these hotter months, that water runs cold. And usually that's going to be due to the groundwater supply that they have, the relatively high altitude tributaries that are flowing down south, and then obviously the cold water discharge coming out of the reservoirs. You kind of see with some of the rivers associated with the main stem or the Beaverkill without having the reservoir water in July already kind of approaching, high 60s, low 70s. And so the different characteristics make up for a variety of possibilities. And what we'll see in the next slide is that it becomes this really crazy mix and match of how you go about chasing trout. And it's not to say that some of those other game fish we mentioned aren't available up in the upper Delaware, but trout kind of call this home, at least for a sport or an angler pursuit. the Delaware River hatch chart that I have here, that's one of 60 plus guides and lodges that are listed as available in the upper Delaware solely for the reason of trout fishing. And if you look closely enough, you'll see that the scientific and common names for these aquatic insects are broken out by size, and then obviously where you can use them indicated by the dark square during those given months. And a lot of these concentrate on what we refer to as dry flies, so flies that are going to sit on top of the water. You also have streamers, which would represent bait fish or larger bugs, nymphs, terrestrials. There's a plethora of names out there. So everything from when the bug is in the larval stage to as it moves through the water column to when it rises off the water surface, and even things like parachute, where the insect after mating above water will then fall back down into the water. And so what you typically end up with is something like on the top right, and this is just one small example of what my basement looks like, is you have Ziploc bags, you have different tackle boxes, bins. And I have so much stuff from Hobby Lobby as far as what I store flies in, that and it's everywhere. It's not only in my basement, it's in my car, it's at my office, it's strewn about the house. So you have egg patterns, and it's really just based on the year, it's based or the time of year, based on where you're going, based on the species that you're pursuing. And you kind of are looking to mimic some of those species that are on the bottom there, with the stonefly on the far left, the hellgrammite, the Dobson fly, which is the adult version of the hellgrammite, and there's a picture of a slimy sculpin there. And so it's funny. So with dry fly fishing, obviously, or any type of fly fishing, you're looking to use a synthetic bait. But you go out with a hook and worm, you go out with spin gear, and you can pursue plenty of these species. There are a few different individual manufacturers of lures in the area that will work specifically on these streams. You have some of the time tested ones like Rapala, Panther Martin, as far as spinners are concerned. And like most other folks, I started fishing with just a bobber and a worm for trout. And so there's plenty of approaches to it. And I think one of the most important things in regards to trout fishing is really just the care that you take in looking out after the trout fishery, because these fish are so relatively fragile compared to some of the warmer water species. There's a lot that goes into it regarding what type of tackle you use, how you fight the fish, how you handle the fish, how you release the fish, and everything under the sun. And so while we look at that a lot for trout, it's obviously applicable to every other game fish that we pursue, as well as even the bait that we use. Like the hellgrammite that we have printed there or posted there, that I remember being a kid traveling out to the water gap to camp, and hellgrammites were selling for $1 a piece, live hellgrammites. I don't know what they go for these days, and I have found some hellgrammites that are anywhere in the range of 3 to 5 inches. That Dobson fly, that's the one and only one I've ever seen live. So we're going to use bait, obviously, and if we go to the next slide, we'll kind of get an understanding why. So this is where we move into the quote unquote lower Delaware, but this is going to be everything between the Delaware Water Gap and Trenton. And because all these species kind of fit into the main stem of the Delaware, there is no shortage of food, and they're all high prey drive, predatory type fishes that will look to eat a variety of bait, whether it's live or cut. So the last statement about the hellgrammite come against odds, when we're talking about fishing here in this portion of the Delaware. So live bait kind of rules all, from the hellgrammites, the minnows, to just worms, like I mentioned before with trout. Nevertheless, we have the same appreciation and respect that applies to the fish that we handle as well as the bait. So I could spend hours talking on this slide about all the fish that you see listed here, as well as the ones that you don't. From fly rod to spin rod to bait caster, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of approaches to these species. It's almost like a factorial. But what I'll do, at least as far as this page is concerned, is I'll give you two fishtails. So we'll kind of take, the title of the presentation and put it to use. So I mentioned going to the water gap fishing when I was a kid, and I had fished farm ponds a lot. growing up. And so the Delaware River was like one of the first formidable challenges that I had as far as large water bodies of fishing. And I remember standing on a rock 10 feet from shore and casting a hula popper as far as I could across the Delaware. And just made sense. Looks like a frog. I know bass eat frogs. So I throw this hula popper in and I just walk it across the surface of the water back towards myself. And sure enough, it was just one smallmouth bass after another. And this is me coming with relatively low experience fishing the Delaware and just making out like a bandit. And oddly enough, not only that trip, but a few others, I had seen squirrels swim across the Delaware. And at this point now, I've seen bears swim across the Delaware. I've seen deer swim across the Delaware. So when I say that there is an appropriate amount of food for all these species, it's really no lie because obviously those, other references are a little bit too big, but that doesn't mean that that meat at some point doesn't end up in the Delaware for the catfish and some of the larger, bottom feeders. And then obviously you have everything from minnows to crayfish to frogs to even mice feeding some of your medium-sized game fish. And so then for the second example that I'll give you is catching a walleye and a catfish at basically the same time. So this happened a little bit more recently. I was floating down the Delaware. Um, I think we were using a swim bait, so actually it was a little plastic sunfish mimic. And this walleye just came up and took it, which is great. To catch a walleye, one of the more prized fish in the Delaware system. But then out of nowhere, this catfish came up trying to attack the walleye. And so a friend of mine that was in the boat with me just tossed, I think it was the same type of lure behind me, and ended up hooking the catfish at the same time. So at the same moment, we had a walleye, which is, not necessarily a bottom feeder, obviously high predator, taking the one bait, and then a catfish, which is typically going to be a nocturnal feeder, feeding at night on cut bait and stuff that's been in the water for a long time, took the opportunity to try to take this walleye, which was about half of its size, if not, even bigger than that. So trying to put something relatively large in its mouth and ended up catching both of them. So that's the type of fishing that you can expect throughout the Delaware system largely. Obviously here between the Water Gap and Trenton is kind of the areas that we focus on for these species, but there's no wrong way to kind of go about it if you're looking to just get on the water and go fishing. So again, I mentioned the hook, the worm, the bobber, wander into any tackle shop. Use this chart here because this chart actually does a really great job from Pennsylvania Fish and Boat to kind of give you an idea of the species as well as what to use, where to use it, and how to use it. And pictures on the right there, that's one of the carp that I talked about before as being a warm water species just hanging out in the canal. You can throw mulberries to them, you can throw corn to them. I know folks that throw worm to them when they're on the bottom. And then this smallmouth bass I caught maybe just in March or April, feeding on what we call greeny weenies, which is basically a pipe cleaner, a green pipe cleaner, and it mimics some of the green caterpillars that fall into the Delaware early in the season. But a smallmouth like that would hit any swim bait, crankbait with your Rapalas and spinners, obviously, as well as a plethora of flies that you can kind of walk across the surface with your poppers. Really exciting. You fight anything like either one of those on relatively light tackle. You're talking a 3 or 4 weight fly rod or a spin rod with, 8, 10 pound test, and you're going to have a good time. And thinking about this presentation, I should have brought it up sooner. I could spend hours talking about individual species, how I've pursued them, and the copious amount of stories behind each one. But, I'll try to stay focused and then I can answer some of those questions or at least give some recommendations at the end. And then obviously I'll have my contact information up so that anybody who wants to talk fishing can get in touch with me. All right, so with that, we'll go to the next slide. All right, so here we're going to kind of move into the estuary of the Delaware. So this is really, we're talking Trenton south down to the border that we have here between Cape May and Delaware. which then opens up into the larger Atlantic. I haven't had a chance to fish this far south yet, but I'm familiar enough with most of the species to basically say that you want to have a boat. Um, you have plenty of shore access points, but then once the Delaware kind of opens up into the bay, there's a lot of species that you want to pursue with a boat. But knowing, that's not always possible, or to hop on a party boat, we'll kind of just go down the list with a few of these. We'll start with drum and sea bass. These are great higher into the estuary and under the cover with close rocks. Larger drum will be out in the open water. And so a lot of these are going to hit on cut bait on the bottom for the same way that you'd approach flounder. You just figure a big weight, a relatively large circle hook, and then you can jig from as well, where you'd put down a leaded jig head with, a rubber trailer and kind of just move it on and off the bottom. Moving on to the cobia, this is a dream fish for me. This isn't something I've necessarily be able to go out and pursue, but big live fish or live bait style fishing, trolling with spoons, and some of the eel style surgical tubing lures work as well, and then bucktails. And these fish can get relatively big. Some of these are going to obviously push 3-4 feet, and from what I heard, great table fare. Spotted sea trout. I kind of made it apparent that I do love trout, so naturally this is one of my favorites. And then for fishing spotted sea trout or speck, anything that you would fish, striped bass, bluefish, even red drum for would work with these, at least the smaller ones. So you think bucktails, swim baits, anything that mimics a minnow is going to work. Flounder or fluke, bucktails again. This is another one where they're bottom dwellers, obviously, and I don't know how many folks know this, but I kind of found this out in high school that when fluke, and fluke is just another term for summer flounder and winter flounder, when they're born, they hatch, upright the way that you'd expect most fish. And as they move from that par or even alvin stage, they start to flatten out and one of their eyes migrates to the top to join the other one, which I think is pretty fascinating. And obviously, because they live their life on the bottom, they're always looking up. So fishing for these, you kind of always look for ridge lines so that you can move your bait over from a relatively lower depth to a deeper depth, and then they'll see that kind of come across the shelf and they'll attack it. All these fish are voracious eaters. You kind of just have to find them. But even with that being the case, and what we saw with the previous slide with the freshwater species, there's going to be a whole chart as far as when you can pursue these species, how to pursue these species, the best way to pursue these species. So it's really amount of research. There's no limit to the amount of reading that you can do when looking at any one of these species and the amount of overlap they have. So blogs, regulations, obviously, fishing forums, scientific research journals, or even social media. There's a lot of information out there, and you can actually learn relatively quickly on how and when and where you need to be to pursue any one of these species. So with that, let's go to the next slide, and we're going to kind of do a little bit more of a concentration on some of the species that I mentioned before. So if I had to choose a favorite freshwater species and saltwater species, it would be trout, obviously, for freshwater, and then it would be striped bass for salt. And that kind of runs into some odds because we have striped bass all the way up here where I'm at, the confluence of Cooks Creek. I'll show you a video here in a little bit of actually seeing them, but I was just down at the confluence of Cooks with the Delaware less than a week ago, and there were about 30 or 40 striped bass just sitting in the mouth of Cooks, just eating eels, and it was awesome. I couldn't catch any of them, regardless of what I threw. They knew exactly what they wanted, and I didn't have the bait that impersonated an eel well enough. And so I really just watched, and I was with my daughter. So that was a cool experience in itself. But striped bass, nevertheless, they're hardy. They're relatively long-lived, and they can be massive. So I think some of the fish that are the records push somewhere in the 60, 70. I think the record's 81 pounds. Um, And like I mentioned, they're not just salt water, they're freshwater as well. These are migratory fish. And while you have the absolute monsters out in the Atlantic, you will see stripers in the upper reaches of the Delaware pushing 24, maybe even 30 inches. Now, there's a lot of regulations behind these, and you kind of see on the map from the far left, as well as that graph, just what has necessarily happened to the striped bass fishery over the recent decades. The graph, I think itself, is explains itself very well. You had an absolute bathtub effect of striped bass back in the a couple decades ago. I think the 70s and 80s, and then you had a lot of different states actually come together, understanding the problem. And with that map on the left-hand side, you can actually see the states there in red that still don't allow commercial fishery for striped bass. And I've remembered that being the case since I was a kid. And I lived down in Virginia, and I think when I first saw striped bass at a local market in Virginia, I couldn't believe it because I was like, I've never seen this before, having been from New Jersey. And when you look at their lifestyle pattern, it's actually really interesting because the Chesapeake is where they do most of their breeding. So again, this is another anadromous species. So they breed in these larger, relatively freshwater systems. That's where they spawn. That's where the fish are initially hatched, and then they come out into salt water to grow and rear. And so every year, you can see fish largely exit the Chesapeake Bay, start to move north. They're kind of joined by the brood stock that comes out of the Delaware Bay. And then you have a couple pockets here and there up and down the East Coast. And from basically March through late summer, early fall, they'll migrate as far up as Maine and Nova Scotia before they come back and start what's referred to as the fall run. You'll kind of see that referred to down there in the right side with where a lot of these fish tend to congregate. And I have a few. These are actually Rhode Island stripers because, like I said, I haven't been lucky enough to catch a striped bass in the Delaware yet. But I remember, and this is funny too, because I was working at a relatively commercial site, so there were buildings in the background, and it was September, and the bait fish were in so heavy that the striped bass and the bluefish were actually pushing the bait fish onto shore. So you would see these, miniature tidal waves coming towards shore as these bass and bluefish chase these bait fish, and the bait fish would beach themselves. And I was throwing a 9-inch long topwater lure parallel to shore. Like I wasn't even casting out, I was casting along shore and retrieving this topwater lure along the surface of the water in and out of all this bait. And so striped bass takes it, or at least, one of these predatory fish takes it, and they swim this big giant arc from my far left all the way to my far right. And I can already tell it's a striped bass because bluefish will just run and they'll bury and they'll try to get you off immediately. Striped bass are a little bit more cumbersome in their fight. And before I knew it, I had a fish that was probably in excess of 3 feet, maybe even pushing 40 inches. And I mentioned the commercial part initially because the windows of these offices started opening up, asking me to pick up this fish. So these are folks that are still working, seeing me catching this, 20, 30 pound fish, and just they wanted to get in on the action. And that would be usually the case early in spring or at least May, June when the fishing kind of picked up in Rhode Island, and then again in September and October when the fall run headed back down. And I'll bring that back around to the Delaware itself because right now, even as high up here as Cooks Creek, and I know that they're up into the where the East Branch and the West Branch kind of confluence, you'll see them come during heavy rains when the tributaries start to flow out. You will see striped bass move in and out of these areas. And so there's a fishery here too that lasts just the way that it does out in the Atlantic. You just have to know where to look. And like I said, yeah, you locate the fish, you got a better chance of obviously catching them. But I kind of put my foot in my mouth there where I said that that's all you have to do because case in point was me not catching them on Cooks the other day. But As far as Delaware fishing, down in the estuary, you're looking at the topwater lures that I kind of mentioned already, bucktails, larger rapalas, any type of live bait, the eels especially. Striper love eels at a certain time of year. Down there, it's a little bit more when and we'll get into the eel migration here soon because that is definitely unique, even amongst all these other unique species. And once you get into the system up here, you can use fly rods. You got to go a little bit heavier, probably an 8-9 weight. You can use spin rods, you can use bait casters, and again, you're just trying to mimic anything that they would want. They'll take down ducklings, they'll take frogs, they'll take the eels, obviously. So they'll take, any type of live minnow. It just has to really be based on what they are feeding on at that time. So if I had a live eel the other night when I saw these stripers, that'd have been easy. I even had my daughter with worms, and they wouldn't even take that. And it's like, this looks exactly the same as an eel, at least you would think, but they're pretty smart. And they have to be able to do this type of migration every year to kind of get back to their natal areas, just like salmon do. The benefit here with striped bass is they're long-lived, so they don't die after that one and only spawn. They come back and they do this again, and they do it, on the neighborhood of decades. And so if there's one word that I would kind of want to use that I hope most folks could take away is fecundity. And that's the ability for a female fish to produce as many eggs as possible for the future years of the species. And the problem that striped bass have kind of run into more recently is the return of those young of the year is a reflection of not a lot of these breeding females making it to these later stages in life where they produce more eggs, where they have obviously outcompeted and outsurvived some of the ones with weaker genetics. And a lot of that is owed to over harvesting initially. There's a lot to be said about bunker harvest down in Chesapeake, where you see a vast majority of striped bass as far as spawning grounds are concerned. So much so that when I was in Rhode Island from this fishtail that I was telling you about, the limit was, I think, one or two fish over 28 inches. So you could keep a bass that was 70 pounds, or you could keep a bass that was 7 pounds, as long as it was over 28 inches. What Rhode Island and a lot of the other states have done is they've gone to a slot limit where you have to have a fish between 28 and 31 inches, and it's usually about one daily fish. And this has been a large joint effort by a lot of the states. And what I'll say is, for that, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is kind of a great source of information to go and check anything else out on that, if you're interested. All right, so we'll move on here and we'll touch lightly on the shad. So in preparation for this lecture, I actually listened to one of the previous lectures, and it was on the Lewis shad fishery. So if you're an angler and you're any way associated with, whether it be American history, the Delaware, angling, it's a great presentation, so I have to give it its rightful plug. And I've yet to be to Shad Fest. This year I actually made a point to go, took the day off of work, pulled my daughters out of school, only to realize that Shad Fest was not on that Friday, but in fact started on Saturday, and I had another commitment, so I missed Shad Fest for the second year in a row. And this is only the third summer that I've been here. The first summer I didn't even know. But I know that we've been going at it for about 40 minutes, so I'll kind of run through these slides a little bit. I'll try to tell a few more fish tales, and we'll get to the Q&A. But for a quick history on shad, it's the largest member of the herring family, at least for Pennsylvania. It's historically vital to the Native Americans and early settlers. I think it's even credited with saving Washington's troop at Valley Forge. They're another anadromous species. They live in the ocean and they return to fresh water to spawn. You got females that produce up to 300,000 eggs. And you can kind of think of shad as the migratory buffet of the Delaware for striped bass, along with the eels. So you drive anywhere along the Delaware in April to June, and you'll see shad fishermen anchored out. And again, this is not another species that I pursued, but I remember growing up and having shad darts and never actually using them. So it's another thing that I need to pursue. So again, if you're familiar with the Lewis shad fishery, you can see and understand how important and lucrative a fishery it was. But today, the Delaware actually remains the only major Pennsylvania waterway fully accessible to their migration. That's because there's no dams in the main stem, and it's not until you get to the east and west branch of the Delaware and those reservoirs that you have any um, any issue with them migrating, and it's hugely important. So you are starting to see a little bit more of an uptick in the return, but you see there on the graphs, how detrimental it was in the recent decades from what was relatively high, 70, 80, 100 years ago. All right, keep moving along. Uh, next slide, please. So at this point, I'll kind of apologize that I'm moving from one tragedy to the next, trying to build up some of these species a little bit with their rebounding. But this might be the absolute bottom before we start to, literally and figuratively climb back up to the bank. But this slide focuses on the Atlantic sturgeon, but the short-nosed sturgeon is found in the Delaware Estuary as well. And these are basically dinosaurs. I mean, you have a slow growing, so again, remember the word fecundity, species that's endangered due to overfishing, pollution, habitat loss, and the juveniles use the tidal Delaware as a nursery before they migrate into the ocean. And there are stories about the Delaware, and I want to say Philadelphia, where they would basically dispatch sturgeon as bycatch. They were after other species, and if they caught a sturgeon, it was basically dog food. It hadn't really hit the caviar market, hadn't really hit any other kind of market. And even the Potomac, there are stories of them cruising along, and these fish get to be over 10 feet, some of them upwards of 14 feet, and they live for over a century. I've caught them, not these, I've caught their Pacific cousin out in Oregon, and it's basically like raising a telephone pole off the bottom of whatever body of water you're in. They are critically protected, and I don't think you could Google Atlantic sturgeon and not see something in the news of relative recency. There is just one effort after another to recover them, and you can kind of see here the different critical habitats that they have from all the way down south all the way to the north of Maine. And what you'll see in the graphs there specifically is the amount of loss from bycatch, especially in recent years. And then obviously, that's from the inset, and then the larger graph, uh, what you've seen landings. Now they're not necessarily targeted, so with every graph you kind of have this area of error because you can't target them, but through samplings alone, they are not a lot out there. And then the graph obviously there with the life cycle kind of speaks to the fecundity piece where they have to get to a certain age to be able to breed. And then the older they get, the more they're able to reproduce egg-wise. And that's why it's important to keep the longer lived ones around. All right, so with that, we'll move on to our final migratory species, the American eel. And so this one is awesome because it's catadromous. So it's the opposite of the striped bass, the sturgeon, the shad. It actually spawns in salt water, and then the juvenile eels move into freshwater. And this is only something that's really been discovered recently. It was always this really big mystery, and there's not a whole lot of it that's still understood. And it takes place in the Sargasso Sea. So you have these adult eels that meet in this relatively not general area, but obviously thousands of square miles. And they produce these filament size offspring that will drift with the ocean currents until they're able to make it to individual freshwater systems, the Delaware obviously being the one that we have, and they'll live there for 10 to 20 years before they move back out to the Sargasso Sea to go through that process again. And so it's the inverse of what we talked about. Um, Delaware River weirs, they were, kind of symbolic as far as the eel fishery was concerned for the longest time. Kind of went through the whole issue with overfishing them and then falling out of style. And so you can still see some of the weirs as you travel around the Delaware. They're basically these really big rock formations that would kind of funnel them in. And if we've learned anything about rock formations in rivers, they don't only hamper your fishes, they hamper a lot of other species as well, especially your macroinvertebrates. You can fish for these. The picture here on the top right, I actually netted. It was the first one that I've netted doing a minnow survey. Super excited to have been able to catch it because I had seen them before and not had everything that I needed to catch them. And this one was actually found 7.5 miles up from Cooks Creek confluence with the Delaware. Oh, we got a little visitor here. Thank you. Um, so it obviously came in from the Sargasso Sea. And this thing, it's only measuring about, 120 millimeters, 12 centimeters. Came in from the Sargasso Sea, made it through the Delaware River, made it up to the confluence of Cooks Creek and the Delaware, and then made it up to a tertiary tributary where I found it and located it, measured it, took a picture. So it's a real testament to their durability. Nocturnal feeders live under rocks, grass beds. If you get down to the Delaware snorkeling, you'll find one. And if you go fishing at night for catfish, 9 times out of 10, you'll probably end up hooking into an eel, and they make great striper bait, as I said before. All right, let's move to the next slide. All right, so here is one of our more prolific players, the frankenfish. This is the northern snakehead, and this is an introduced species. This is an invasive species. They've basically moved up from Maryland and Virginia tidewaters. They're now being found in the Delaware. They've been found down south, as this one kind of shows. Bucks County, I know they found one up at Fry's Run just here in Regalsville area. And you want to talk about a voracious fish. They produce a lot of offspring, they grow really fast, and they will eat practically anything. And so I kind of go back to the question that I asked before as to whether is there going to be a point where we look at this frankenfish, this invasive introduced species, and if it pushes out some of our native species or even our non-native species, are we at some point going to just accept it as is? We're now in this age of conservation. Are we going to be able to put the right parameters in place to protect our native species? And with that, we'll go to our next slide as far as what that looks like. So we have the bowfin, and I briefly mentioned them earlier in the presentation, but these are our native fish. So if anything, in addition to the word fecundity, know the difference between northern snakehead and the bowfin. Northern snakehead for right now, there's no limit. You can keep as many as you want. It's basically a kill order from the regulation side of the house that we want to get rid of these. And you'll see the chart on the right as far as the amount of observations that are being witnessed. And you can see that between the Chesapeake and the Delaware, that's where the concentration of these have been. So it's a growing issue, and we're approaching it a lot differently than we've seen some of these other introduced species in the past. Okay, so with the last couple of minutes, what I want to just do is kind of talk a little bit microcosmically about some of our tributaries. And so at the beginning, I mentioned that I'm with the Cooks Creek Watershed Association. And since this spring, I've embarked on a minnow survey to document the different minnows that are within Cooks Creek, because these are the, I wouldn't say unappreciated, but underappreciated backbone of the game fishery that we pursue. And so we have the slimy sculpin here, we have the eastern black-nosed dace, tessellated darter, and the common shiner, all common native fishes of Pennsylvania, great indicators of water quality, and present here in Cooks Creek and in many other tributaries throughout the Delaware system. If we go to the next slide, this is more from April, and as the water started to warm up, I started seeing bluegill fry. So those are those two little pictures of fish there on the right-hand side, in addition to my common shiner there and my black-nosed dace. A fish, the bluegill, that we've commonly associated with just a regular bream, a regular panfish, a regular sport fish here in this area, but moving further and further into some of these what used to be cold water tributaries that are now seeing an uptick in temperature. And Cooks Creek, and I should have started with this, is one of two brook trout creeks, native brook trout, with a spawning population within Bucks County. So to see some of these warmer species begin being present is a little bit problematic. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a few more of the native species, and this was in a higher elevation tributary. But even with this being relatively recent, even more recently, I've seen some of the largemouth bass. I've seen more of the bream present in these, and there's our eel again that made it 7.5 miles up the system. And what we'll show on the next slide is a little bit more of a feel-good story. This is a tributary to Cooks Creek. And while the brook trout there on the top left in the images is deceased, it represents a breeding female that most likely lived its entire life in this tributary, laying X amount of eggs through, its time and dying hopefully of old age. There was no puncture marks, there was nothing like that. Water was relatively cool. Still somewhere I think in the low 60s, and this was even in May. And my point is to get back up there and check these waters again. But I say that slimy sculpin, you have brown trout. These are introduced species, and one concern, or at least one hope, is that brown trout, if they can stay below the culvert line, they can't get above culverts, they can't get above certain elevation gradient changes, that you could keep at least somewhat of a strong change or difference between brook trout and browns. But here you have a relatively larger brown and they have a brown trout par, both occupying the same system as this large yet deceased brook trout. So if we go to the next slide, I got one more example. So I've been used to seeing all these different species, and then that one on the left, that's a long-nosed dace, had only caught in the black-nosed dace. So there is a variety of, and again, another good indicator of water quality. And another species that I did not know was present in Cooks Creek. Had a pretty good idea, but now I have visual and documented evidence. And so this is a project that I'm personally involved with, and hoping to get other spots along Cook so that I can, make some type of publication, if you will, to speak to the importance of not only some of these tributaries to the Delaware, but also the tributaries to these tributaries. And stream system orders is a conversation for another day. And so what I have next is a video that kind of puts all this in a frame of reference. So this was taken last year after Hurricane Debbie, and this was at the confluence of Cooks Creek with the Delaware, and it was thousands of juvenile eels moving between the systems, and the striped bass just having an absolute mayhem of a day feeding on them. And so obviously we see that we have eels in Cooks, we have striped bass at Cooks, we have all those minnows and trout species that I just mentioned, and it's just a microcosmic example of the Delaware Basin itself, from the reaches of the East and West Branch in the north, everything down through Trenton, Philly, and into the estuary. You have this wide variety of species, this diversification between temperatures and habitats, and it is something that is to be protected, it's to be honored, it's to be appreciated because of the diversity that it represents and the hope that it represents as far as us being good stewards to the environment. So with that, I think I have one last slide, because I would be remiss to say that even with the appreciation I have for minnows, this is the foundation of the fisheries. And it's those little bugs that not a whole lot of folks know what they are outside of our entomologists. But the macrovertebrates of the rivers is key. They are the keystone species, at least in my opinion, to everything and that we've just talked about. And so next time you're out on the water, flip over a rock, see what you got, come back to this chart or use your iPhone, because I think iPhones are actually pretty good at identifying bugs and mushrooms, not necessarily birds or fish or anything else. So with that, I'll kind of leave it there. My last slide, a little play, fin, just, finish. my contact information and some of the associated links. I'll make the shameless plug for Facebook and Instagram. Cooks Creek is a nonprofit. We're always just looking for folks to interact with. And we appreciate your follows or anything like that on Instagram or Facebook. I have plenty of stuff posted there as far as events and some of the other fishtails that we've come across. If you are looking for your watershed association, or if you're curious about what watershed you may live in, send me an email, send me a text, call me. But the Watershed Coalition of Lehigh Valley there is kind of an umbrella organization that has monthly meetings with 13 to 14 different organizations within the Lehigh Valley. And that's not just for the Lehigh River, but it's also for the Delaware as well. So, we have Fry's Run, we have Cooks Creek, obviously. I think Tohickon is on the agenda for getting one. Musconetcong is obviously on the other side of the Delaware. I know they have a watershed association, and there's a lot stretching in the Poconos and up the Lehigh. And so with that, I've talked for about an hour. I'm not sure how long we have for Q&A, but I'm more than happy to talk about anything that anybody wants to speak to. So thank you.
So please put your questions in Q&A. We don't have any yet, so that's kind of a surprise. You gotta have a question. That catching two fish story was pretty cool.
I had to have some type of tail in there. I mean, I have a lot of them, and obviously I have the ones about, the fish that got away too.
The proverbial fish that got away.
Yeah, yeah. Oh.
I'll give you another minute to think about and type up a question.
Are they able to unmute and ask too?
No, in webinar they can't, so they do have to type
Hmm.
them on Q&A or even chat if that's easier for you. I got one, yay! What are some of the conservation dangers that you see?
Conservation dangers. I don't know. It's kind of tough, and I guess what immediately jumps to mind is that some of your best conservationists are your anglers, and sometimes some of your worst conservationists are your anglers, because I will come across stuff streamside that I could never dream of, or hear about stuff that I could never dream of. Discarded fishing line, discarded hooks, lead sinkers, stories about people taking pictures of fish only for social media and then dispatching them in an unethical way. So I think a lot of the piece that goes out there is just understanding how to be a good citizen scientist, if you will. And so, everybody has their place, and this goes not only from those that are anglers, but everything that you do within a watershed makes a difference. And that goes to the what you put on your lawn, how you mow your lawn, what flowers you plant, that all has a type of trickle down effect for conservation. And so, I'll kind of go the other way as far as, what I don't like to see in conservation to what I do like to see in conservation. And that is some of the smallest efforts make a big difference if enough folks do it.
How often are you skunked?
Sorry?
How often are you skunked?
Oh,
I guess,
skunked?
yeah.
A lot. A lot. I've caught one brook trout, well, two brook trout, native brook trout, since moving here about 3 years ago. And there are plenty of times where I will see a trout and I will try to bring it, have it rise on my fly, just not interested. And so that usually, and I'll see fish feeding and still not be able to hook them. And so that's at the point where I'm flipping over rocks, trying to get an idea of what they're actually hitting and seeing if I can refine my cast a little bit more to present it in such a way that they want it. But I get skunked often. I mean, I got skunked the other day seeing all those stripers around the Cooks Creek confluence of the Delaware. I couldn't believe it either. I was like, they're right here, they're feeding, but they knew exactly what they wanted, and it wasn't anything that I was throwing.
It'd be tough when you see them and you can't even get one in.
Oh yeah, yeah, it can be a real heartbreaker.
Yeah. All right. What approach do you use to catch the darters, shiners, and other small fish?
Oh, great question. So I have a variety of nets. I have a kick net, which is basically long handled with a reinforced square style net that has very fine mesh, almost imagine like a cheesecloth. And so what's done with that is you'll place it behind where you're looking to sample, and these fish are typically hiding under rocks. You'll remove the rock and you'll kind of create a little commotion so that they will move towards the net itself. Um, and that way, obviously with some of this sampling, you are going to disturb the river bottom, and the idea is to disturb it as little as possible, put stuff back where you can find it, but then I'm able to transplant whatever I do catch into a bucket and then into that sight tank that you saw so that the fish never really leaves the water or the temperature that it needs to be acclimated to. There's other ways you can use the seine net for some of your larger fish, those that are a little bit more hardy. Some folks will microfish, so they'll use the smallest hooks you can imagine, like size 24, 26, and they'll fish for them. But I've found that kick nets and even dip nets, which are kind of the same thing, are usually the least invasive and the most productive. And sometimes I'll just, I will gently go through the water with a small butterfly style net that I can just dip and raise from underneath the fish so that it kind of never even sees it coming.
I don't know. That doesn't sound fair.
There's a lot to it. It's tedious, but it's great because you really see. And one more quick story. Last October, when we were coming towards the end of the drought, I was in Cooks and I was seeing panfish, so some of our native pumpkin seed, in a color pattern that looked like tropical fish. Because the water was so low and because it was only groundwater and it was fall and the spawn season, these fish were taking on such vibrancy that they could have passed as tropical fish. And so then to be able to see them up close like that, it's unbelievable.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So Travis, I want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure listening to your fish tales and learning about what's in our Delaware River.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. And like I said, for anybody that's out there, feel free to send me an email or send me a text. And if you got any questions, I'm more than happy to have the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
All right. Thanks all.